Hello mathematicians. Today's video is going to introduce the basics of our unit on slope and linear equations and the basics of the coordinate plane. So our objective is students will be able to draw and label the coordinate plane. Take a minute and press pause if you need to, and then resume the video to see the notes. The main point of today's video is to learn the different parts of a graph that we'd use when we talk about linear equations, slope, y-intercepts. The main type of graph that we use is called the Cartesian coordinate system. Okay? And that's just a big fancy name for a graph that has points that are x and y that we can plot. So the first thing I want to do is label the graph itself, and then we'll fill in the vocabulary words. So looking at this graph, the first thing we want to label is the axes. Okay, the axes are the things that run left and right and up and down. If you're looking, okay, this first axis you see, this one right here that I'm like coloring in red, that's the x-axis. Okay, we remember that's the x-axis because it runs horizontally or it goes left and right. The axis that goes up and down, this one that I'm coloring in blue, that axis, that is called the y-axis. That's the axis that runs vertically or up and down. And when you're looking at the graph, where the two axes intersect is considered the point 0, 0. So first of all, I'm going to write a 0 in here. Okay, that's where 0 is. This point right here is 0, 0. Let's actually kind of draw an arrow over here. Okay, and the name that we use for that point, 0, 0, is called the origin. Okay, if you think about what the word origin means, if I said something like the origin of species, okay, that was a book written by Darwin, that means like the beginning. Where does it all start? How does it all start? So 0, 0 is where it starts. And what that 0, 0 means is that here's 0 on, let's say, the x-axis, and we're looking at the axis that runs horizontally. If you think that that's 0, then the number to the right of that is going to be 1, and then you'll have 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Okay? Now, if we go the other way on the x-axis, we're going to have negative numbers. So we'll have a negative 1, negative 2, negative 3, negative 4, negative 5, negative 6. Okay? It's kind of just like a number line, right? The x-axis looks like a number line. Now we can use that 0 point for the y as well. If we go up from 0 on the y-axis, the vertical axis, we're going to have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6. Okay, and notice I'm writing those numbers right on the lines themselves. That's where the points are. Okay, and on the going down, we'll have negative 1, negative 2, negative 3, negative 4, negative 5, negative 6, negative 7. So we have the x-coordinate, the x-axis, we have the y-axis, we have the origin. The last thing I want to talk about is something called quadrants. And quadrants tell us what part of the graph something falls in and describes the sort of coordinates that fall into that quadrant. We'll talk about coordinates or ordered pairs in a later objective. Right now I want you to just think, okay, this is what quadrant is this? So the first quadrant we always started is the quadrant in which both the x and the y values are positive. So if we look, here's where x is positive, here is where y is positive. So this is our quadrant number 1. Okay, that's the quadrant we always start in. The quadrant where the x and the y values are both positive. Then the rest of the quadrants go counterclockwise. So what I mean by counterclockwise is you think, okay, which way does a clock move? And then you move backwards. So normally our clock, if we think of a clock over here, right? Our clock, and here's 12, here's 3, here's 6, and here's 9. Normally the clock moves this way, right? The hands on the clock move this way. So when we do this system, we're actually going to move the opposite way. We're going to move this way. So that means that we're going to have the coordinates move to the left. So this would be our second quadrant. This would be our third quadrant. And this is our fourth quadrant. I want you to also notice that I use Roman numerals to make the quadrants. That's how we label them. We don't label them 1, 2, 3, 4 with numbers. We use Roman numerals. And just so we have an idea, I kind of touched on this, but I want to just make sure that you have a general idea, and it will make a little bit more sense when we talk about points. The main reason we use quadrants is to kind of tell us what is the signs or what's the value of the coordinates in those points. And so in the first quadrant, you're always going to have coordinates that have both positive values. So positive and a positive. In that second quadrant, you're going to have an x value that's negative. Notice our x's are negative, and a y value that's positive. In that third quadrant, you're going to have x value that's negative and a y value that's negative. And in that fourth quadrant, you're going to have a y value that's, an x value that's positive and a y value that's negative. Those are all the different basic parts of the graph. Let's take a minute right now and let's fill in the vocabulary that we have below just to make sure that we're on the same page. So we've kind of talked about these different things, but now let's fill it in together. All right, so the x-axis, okay, we talked about the x-axis, that's the horizontal axis. So I'm going to write the horizontal axis. Okay, if it helps you to think about, that's the axis that's going to move from left to right. So that's the axis that goes left to right. And if you want to draw a picture, here's the coordinate system. The x-axis is this one right here. The y-axis, that's the axis that's moving vertical or up and down. So that's the vertical axis, or the one that goes up and down. If we draw a picture, the y is going to be this one up here. The arrows at the end of the axes. So when you look at the graph from above, there's arrows that are at the end of the axes. What those arrows mean is that the line goes on forever. And basically that means that our graph could get bigger and bigger and bigger. We can only make our graph so big that it fits on the paper, but hypothetically that graph could go on forever and ever and ever. So all that means is that the line or the axis goes on forever. The line or the axis goes on forever. All right, we have a definition here. It says the point where the two lines intersect. Okay, think about what that was. What is that point? What is that called when the two lines intersect? That's at the 0, 0 point. She said, all right, that's the origin. That was a new vocabulary word we learned, the origin. If you want to draw a picture of that, here's your coordinate system. The origin is right there at the point where they intersect. That's the 0, 0 point. And then lastly, the thing we learned was the 4 different regions of the graph. Okay, remember we talked about those. Those were called quadrants. Those are called quadrants. If you want to draw a quick picture of that, we have the first quadrant, the second quadrant, the third quadrant, and the fourth quadrant. All right, take a minute and pause the video if you need to fill in any of this information and make sure you've got it down. All right, we are going to go ahead and do a little bit of practice. So I'm going to have you go back up to the 2 graphs from above. Okay, first, I'm just going to kind of walk you through labeling this one. Okay, Okay, if I had asked you, all right, I want you to label a couple of things on this graph. I want you to label where the origin is. Okay, we're going to do this graph up here first. I want you to try labeling the x and y. I want you to label the origin. I want you to number the graph. I want you to label the quadrants. So let's kind of walk through this graph up here first. First, let's label our x and our y-axis. So I'm going to label the x and the y. Okay? I want you to pause the video and try to do the rest. The origin, the number on the graph, and the quadrants. Pause the video and then press play to see the answer. All right, you should have had here's 0, so the origin is going to be right here. We don't see the whole graph, but that's where the origin is. To label your graph, you should have just labeled them 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Sometimes I might say label the graph counting by 2s. All that means is that instead of each line representing 1, each line is going to represent 2. So maybe we labeled our y-axis 2, and then your quadrant should have been 1, 2, 3, and 4. Okay? That concludes our video. Make sure you write down any questions that you might have or things you want to talk about when we get back to class. And be ready to practice.